My name is Melanie. I am 32 years old, and my husband left me bleeding on a hospital curb in the dead of winter. As a forensic accountant, my entire career is built on finding hidden truths in complex webs of lies. I spend my days tracking missing millions, auditing offshore accounts, and exposing corporate fraud. Yet the biggest fraud I ever encountered was sleeping right next to me in my own bed. I had no idea that a careless sticky note left on a kitchen counter would be the thread I pulled to unravel his entire existence. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever trusted someone who turned out to be your worst enemy. It was 11 at night on a freezing Tuesday in November, and the Chicago wind was howling against the sliding glass doors of the hospital discharge bay. I was sitting in a standard-issue vinyl wheelchair, shivering in thin sweatpants and a heavy winter coat that suddenly felt like paper. Less than 12 hours earlier, I had undergone an invasive surgery to remove a large suspected malignant tumor from my abdomen. The anesthesia was still wearing off, making my head spin and my vision blur at the edges. With every shallow breath, I took a sharp, searing pain radiated from the fresh incision line hidden beneath layers of gauze. The bandages were already starting to weep, a slow, warm dampness pressing against my skin. My husband David, a 35-year-old sales director who prided himself on his reliability, had promised he would be waiting in the loading zone exactly at 10:30. I checked my phone for the 20th time. The screen illuminated my pale, exhausted face. 0 new messages. I dialed his number again. It rang exactly 1.5 times before rolling straight to voicemail, the ultimate digital dismissal. I left another message, my voice cracking not just from the dry hospital air, but from a rising tide of panic. I begged him to pick up, reminding him that the nurses needed my bed and that I was in agonizing pain. Another 30 minutes passed. The discharge nurse, a kind but exhausted woman working the night shift, approached me with an apologetic smile. She explained that hospital protocol required them to clear the discharge area, and since my emergency contact was unreachable, I would have to arrange my own transportation. The humiliation burned hotter than my fever. I was a successful professional who managed multi-million-dollar accounts, yet here I was, being ushered out into the freezing snow because the man who vowed to protect me could not be bothered to answer his phone. I ordered a taxi, unable to navigate the ride-share apps with my shaking fingers. The driver helped me into the back seat, glancing with concern at my hunched posture. Every pothole, every sudden stop on the icy Chicago streets sent shockwaves of white-hot agony through my core. I bit my lip until I tasted copper, desperately trying not to cry out. I focused my mind on David, making excuses for him. Maybe his phone died. Maybe he was in an accident on the way to the hospital. My forensic mind, trained to suspect deception, refused to apply that same harsh lens to my own marriage. When the taxi finally pulled up to our house, my heart sank. The property was pitch black. No porch light had been left on for me. No welcoming glow emanated from the living room windows. I paid the driver, tipping him generously for his help, and slowly made my way up the icy front steps. Each movement felt like climbing a mountain. I reached into my purse for my keys, my fingers fumbling through the familiar compartments. They were gone. David had moved my heavy keyring to his car the day before when he drove me to the clinic for pre-op blood work, and he never gave them back. I pounded on the heavy oak door, screaming his name until my throat felt like sandpaper. The silence that answered me was absolute. Shivering violently, my teeth chattering uncontrollably, I pulled out my phone and searched for a 24-hour locksmith. The wait was an agonizing 45 minutes. I huddled against the front door, pulling my coat tighter over my throbbing abdomen, praying that the weeping from my surgical wound would not turn into a full hemorrhage. When the locksmith finally arrived, he took one look at my pale, tear-stained face and worked as fast as he could. I handed over my last $150 in emergency cash, thanked him, and pushed the door open. The house was like a tomb. The air conditioning was somehow running, dropping the indoor temperature to a bone-chilling degree. I locked the deadbolt behind me and leaned heavily against the wall, kicking off my snow-covered boots. I called out for David one last time, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I dragged my feet up the stairs, clutching the handrail for dear life, desperate to fall into my own bed and sleep off this nightmare. But when I entered the master bedroom, I noticed something wrong. The closet door was wide open. I flipped on the light switch. Half of David's clothes were missing. His expensive tailored suits, his heavy winter coats, his favorite casual wear all gone. The matching set of leather luggage we had bought for our honeymoon was completely missing from the top shelf. Confusion warred with the physical pain tearing through my body. Why would he pack his bags? Why would he leave while I was on an operating table? I stumbled back downstairs to the kitchen, desperate for a glass of water, so I could finally take my prescribed painkillers. I leaned against the cold marble island, trying to catch my breath. That was when I saw it. A small, neon yellow sticky note was pressed against the polished stone, sitting right next to the empty coffee maker. The handwriting was rushed, sloppy, and entirely devoid of emotion. I picked it up, my eyes struggling to focus on the blue ink. It read, "Had to fly out for an emergency client meeting to close the Apex deal. Take care of yourself." I stared at the piece of paper, the words burning into my retinas. He knew I was undergoing major surgery today. He knew I would be completely incapacitated. Yet he packed his bags, took my house keys, and flew out of the city for a sales pitch, leaving me to bleed out in the freezing snow. My legs finally gave out. I slid down the side of the kitchen cabinets, hitting the cold tile floor with a heavy thud, clutching the careless piece of paper in my hand as the silence of the empty house swallowed me whole. The cold tile offered no comfort. I spent the remainder of that first night shivering against the kitchen cabinets, too weak to climb the stairs, my surgical wound throbbing with a relentless burning rhythm. When gray morning light finally crept through the blinds, it brought absolutely no relief. Day 2 arrived with a vengeance. A severe post-operative fever had set in, wrapping my brain in a thick, delirious fog. I managed to drag myself to the living room sofa, pulling a knitted throw over my trembling shoulders. Every muscle ached. Every breath was a careful negotiation with pain. I needed to pay a medical bill that had just arrived in my email, an urgent co-pay for the anesthesiologist that I did not want going into collections. My work laptop was upstairs in my home office, and the thought of climbing those steps made my vision swim. Then I spotted David's silver iPad sitting carelessly on the glass coffee table. He never went anywhere without it, but in his frantic rush to abandon me, he must have left it behind. My hands shook violently as I reached for the device. The screen lit up, illuminating my flushed, feverish face in its reflection. We shared the same passcode for our home devices, a simple 6-digit number representing our anniversary. Typing it in felt like a cruel joke now. I opened the web browser to access my banking portal, forcing my blurry eyes to focus on the screen. As a forensic accountant, my daily life revolves around digital trails. I track discrepancies, unearth hidden assets, and spot financial anomalies that others completely miss. But I was not looking for a discrepancy today. I was just trying to pay a simple medical bill so I could close my eyes and surrender to the fever. Before I could load the banking website, a synced iCloud notification dropped down from the top of the screen. It was an email preview from a luxury concierge service. My analytical brain, trained for over a decade to catch financial inconsistencies, immediately snagged on the numbers visible in the preview pane. It was not a flight itinerary for a sudden corporate meeting. It was not a contract confirmation for the Apex deal he had mentioned on that cowardly sticky note. I tapped the notification, holding my breath as the full document loaded onto the screen. It was a digital receipt for a premier ski chalet at a 5-star resort in Aspen, Colorado. The total cost stared back at me in bold black font. $15,000, paid in full. My eyes scanned the itemized list, my forensic instincts entirely overriding my physical agony. The reservation was not for a solo business trip. It was booked for 4 adults. It included private ski instruction, premium lift passes, and chalet massage therapy, and reservations at the most exclusive mountaintop restaurants in the valley. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my bruised ribs. $15,000. While I was rationing my last bit of emergency cash to pay a locksmith just to get into my own freezing home, my husband was funding a luxury winter getaway. A sickening realization settled deep in my stomach. David had planned this. You do not book a $15,000 Aspen chalet on a whim in the middle of November. This had been arranged well in advance, perfectly timed to coincide with my scheduled tumor removal. He knew I would be bedridden. I knew I would be completely dependent on him and unable to ask questions about his whereabouts. Who were the other 3 adults on this extravagant trip? The answer came sooner than I expected, delivered with a casual cruelty that made my feverish blood run completely cold. A second notification chimed through the iPad speakers, this one from Instagram. Our family accounts were linked on this device. The alert indicated that David had just been tagged in a new story. My finger hovered over the icon for a fraction of a second before I clicked it. The app launched, immediately playing a video that would forever alter the course of my life. The screen filled with the blinding white snow and brilliant blue skies of Aspen. There was David's younger sister Caroline holding her phone high to capture the perfect selfie angle. She was laughing loudly, the sharp, piercing sound grating against my pounding headache. The camera panned down to reveal a steaming, luxurious outdoor hot tub surrounded by heavily snow-covered pine trees. Sitting in the bubbling water was David, looking tanned, relaxed, and incredibly healthy. I was leaning back against the edge of the tub, completely unbothered by the fact that he had left his wife bleeding on a hospital curb. Next to him sat his mother, Barbara. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and a thick fur headband, holding a crystal flute filled with expensive champagne. The 3 of them raised their glasses to the camera, clinking them together in a joyful toast to their own entitlement. The video was sickening enough a visual representation of their complete lack of empathy. But the text plastered across the screen was a dagger aimed straight at my chest. Caroline had typed a bright, bubbly caption right over my husband's smiling face, complete with laughing emojis. I read the words over and over, my vision blurring with angry tears. The caption read, "Skipping the drama and leaving the needy wives at home. Family time." Needy wives. The words echoed relentlessly in my feverish mind. I was not a needy wife. I was a woman who had just undergone major surgery to remove a potentially cancerous tumor. A woman who was currently shivering under a thin blanket, nursing a bleeding incision, completely abandoned by the man who had vowed to protect her in sickness and in health. They were not just on vacation. They were actively celebrating my absence. They were mocking my physical vulnerability from a luxury hot tub paid for with hidden funds, completely unaware that they had just handed a forensic accountant the exact digital thread needed to destroy them. The fever finally broke around dawn on the 3rd day, leaving me soaked in sweat, but with a chilling, dangerous clarity. The Instagram video of them toasting in the Aspen snow played on a relentless loop in my mind. The physical agony of my incision was still there, a sharp, burning reminder of my vulnerability, but the emotional paralysis had completely vanished. I was no longer just a discarded wife weeping on a cold tile floor. I was a professional investigator whose personal life had just become an active crime scene. My phone vibrated sharply against the glass coffee table. I expected it to be a careless text from David, another fabricated update about his imaginary business trip. Instead, the screen displayed an encrypted audio call via the Signal app. The caller ID made my brow furrow in confusion. It was Jamal. Jamal was Caroline's husband, a brilliant African-American trauma surgeon who spent vastly more time in the operating room than at any of our insufferable family dinners. We had always shared a quiet, unspoken understanding at those gatherings. He was the outsider, the only person in David's orbit who possessed a working moral compass and saw through the family's toxic vanity. He had stayed behind in Chicago, locked into a grueling 48-hour surgical rotation, while his wife jetted off to the mountains on my dime. I accepted the call. "Melanie." Jamal's voice was incredibly low, echoing slightly, as if he was pacing in a secluded hospital stairwell. "Please tell me you are okay. I just finished a double shift and saw Caroline's post. I am so incredibly sorry." His apology was genuine, thick with exhaustion and secondhand shame. I gripped the phone, my knuckles turning white. "You did not book the trip, Jamal. You have absolutely nothing to apologize for." "I do," he insisted, his tone dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper. "Because I knew something was wrong and I should have warned you before they left." I thought David was just being his usual arrogant self, but this is a whole new level of sick. Jamal explained that 2 days before my surgery, he had stopped by Barbara's house to drop off some insurance paperwork. He walked through the back door unannounced and overheard David, Caroline, and Barbara drinking wine in the kitchen. David was not talking about a sudden client meeting or a high-stakes corporate deal. He was bragging loudly and proudly about finally securing the bag. "Melanie, listen to me carefully." Jamal's voice grew tight with warning. "David told them he had finally figured out a way to leverage your assets without you noticing. He literally called you his personal ATM. They were laughing about how easy it was to keep you distracted with your work and your health issues while he moved things around. He told Caroline to pack her bags for Aspen right then because the funding was fully secured." My breath caught in my throat. My own husband had reduced our entire marriage to a financial heist, presenting my hard-earned money as a trophy to his greedy mother and sister. "There is something else." Jamal continued, the background noise of the hospital paging system filtering through the speaker. "The night before your surgery, David came over to borrow my snow gear. I saw him putting a thick stack of documents into his briefcase. They looked like property deeds or bank bonds. When I asked him about it, he got incredibly defensive and snapped that he was just cleaning out the home office safe. "Melanie, you need to check your safe right now." The call ended with Jamal promising to help me however he could, but his warning had already ignited a roaring fire in my veins. The physical agony of my surgical wound was entirely eclipsed by a massive surge of adrenaline. I pushed myself off the sofa, clutching my abdomen as a fresh wave of pain sliced through my core. I did not care. I needed to get to the home office. The staircase looked like a towering mountain, but the forensic accountant in me was fully awakened. I took the stairs one agonizing step at a time, gritting my teeth against the burning sensation radiating from my stitches, my mind calculating every possible financial vulnerability in our household. I reached the second-floor hallway, leaning heavily against the drywall to catch my breath. I pushed open the door to our shared home office. The room looked perfectly normal at first glance. David's desk was tidy, the bookshelves were organized, and the filing cabinets were firmly shut. But I knew exactly where to look. Hidden behind a heavy oak bookshelf was the wall safe. It was a high-security reinforced steel unit where we kept our most vital documents. Passports, birth certificates, the deed to the house I had purchased entirely with my own money before we even got married, and a substantial stack of emergency bearer bonds I kept for absolute worst-case scenarios. I slid the bookshelf aside with a painful groan. The digital keypad of the safe waited for my input. We had set the master code together 3 years ago. I punched in the familiar 6-digit sequence, my fingers moving strictly from muscle memory. The keypad beeped sharply. A small LED light flashed a harsh warning red. "Error." I paused, thinking my shaking fingers had simply hit the wrong key. I took a deep breath, steadied my hand, and typed the sequence again, slower this time, pressing each digit with absolute precision. Beep. The red light flashed again. "Error. Invalid code." A cold, suffocating dread washed over me. I tried a third time using David's birthday. Error. I tried my birthday. Error. I tried the last 4 digits of his social security number. Error. The digital screen locked me out, displaying a blinking 5-minute countdown timer. The passcode had not just been forgotten, it had been intentionally maliciously changed. The safe was locked, securing my most valuable personal assets behind a wall of impenetrable steel. And the only person who knew the new combination was currently sipping champagne in an Aspen hot tub. The 5-minute lockout timer on the digital display felt like an eternity, but as the sun rose on the 4th day of my abandonment, my tears had completely dried up. Crying was for wives who believed their husbands had simply made a terrible mistake. I was a forensic accountant, facing a premeditated financial heist. My abdomen screamed in protest as I shifted my weight on the hardwood floor, the stitches pulling sharply against my skin. The adrenaline coursing through my veins acted as the ultimate anesthetic. I wiped a sheen of cold sweat from my forehead and stared down the electronic keypad. David was arrogant, but he was not exceptionally smart. He had purchased this specific commercial-grade safe because I recommended it years ago. What he did not know was that I recommended it because my firm frequently audited the manufacturer, and I was intimately familiar with their security flaws. I knew the factory reset protocol. It required a physical bypass key, which David had undoubtedly taken, or a sequence of factory override digits, combined with the serial number stamped right on the underside of the steel hinge. I ran my finger along the cold metal feeling for the engraved numbers and began typing. A complex string of digits. Pound. Star. Enter. A heavy mechanical clack echoed through the quiet room. The thick steel bolts retracted. I pulled the heavy door open. The motion sensor light flickered to life, illuminating absolute emptiness. My breath hitched a sharp intake of air that pulled painfully at my surgical wound. The thick manila envelope containing the original deed to this house, the house I had purchased outright with my own savings before we even walked down the aisle, was gone. The velvet pouch holding $100,000 in emergency bearer bonds, a liquid asset I kept for catastrophic emergencies, had vanished. He had stripped the safe down to the bare metal. A normal person might have collapsed right there. But a switch flipped inside my brain. The betrayal was no longer just marital, it was criminal. David had crossed a line that moved him from a terrible husband to a subject of a financial fraud investigation. And nobody investigates financial fraud better than I do. I pushed myself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the oak desk, and booted up my encrypted work laptop. I connected it to our secure home network and opened my specialized financial tracing software. It was a proprietary program my firm used to reconstruct shattered corporate ledgers and track embezzled funds across international borders. I linked it to our joint checking and savings accounts, feeding the program every routing number and transaction history from the past 36 months. I instructed the software to run a deep dive variance analysis. I needed to see exactly where the money from my stolen bonds had gone and how he had managed to hide his tracks so efficiently. The progress bar crept across the screen, parsing through thousands of data points: credit card swipes, wire transfers, and automated clearinghouse payments. I sat in the leather desk chair, pressing a throw pillow against my stomach to brace my surgical wound, watching the raw data compile. Then the red flags started popping up. Dozens of them. They cascaded down my screen in a waterfall of digital alerts. I leaned in closer, my eyes narrowing at the financial mapping materializing before me. David had not just taken the bonds and the deed. He had constructed an entire hidden labyrinth of shell accounts. I traced a series of recurring automated transfers bleeding out of our joint savings account in increments just small enough to avoid triggering standard banking alerts. They were flowing into a limited liability company registered under a name I had never heard of, which then funneled the cash into 3 separate offshore accounts. I had been operating a shadow economy right under my nose from this very desk, using my own hard-earned wealth to build a secret empire. The sheer scale of the deception scrolling across my monitor was breathtaking. It was a perfectly orchestrated web of deceit designed to drain me dry while keeping me entirely in the dark. Day 5 began with a deep dive into that very darkness. The physical pain from my abdominal surgery was now just a dull hum beneath the roar of my absolute outrage. I sat at my desk for 14 straight hours, subsisting entirely on tap water and pure adrenaline. My fingers flew across the keyboard, running complex cross-referencing algorithms on the raw banking data I had managed to extract from our supposedly secure joint accounts. What I uncovered was a parasitic feeding tube attached directly to my career. For 3 years, David had been meticulously siphoning off my earnings. He used dummy vendor invoices and fabricated consulting fees to mask the withdrawals, making them look like standard business expenses on our tax software. But the money did not go to any legitimate business. It flowed straight through his shell company and into 2 external accounts. A quick reverse lookup confirmed the account holders, Barbara and Caroline. I pulled the itemized spending histories for those accounts, and the sheer audacity made my stomach churn. I was looking at the financial anatomy of their pampered lives. First-class upgrades for Caroline's frequent trips to Miami. Monthly dues for Barbara's exclusive country club in the suburbs. Lease payments for a brand-new imported luxury SUV. Designer handbags, premium spa retreats, and high-end dining. My grueling 60-hour work weeks, my late nights poring over corporate tax structures, my hard-earned promotions all meant nothing to them. I had bled for my career, and David had quietly funneled the rewards to his mother and sister so they could play pretend high society. They saw me as nothing more than a blind, easily manipulated cash cow. But the stolen income was just the appetizer. The real devastation hid deeper in the encrypted files. I noticed an anomaly in our credit monitoring portal, a massive spike in our debt-to-income ratio that made zero logical sense. I logged into the county clerk's digital property database and pulled the current title records for our home. The house I had purchased in full, completely debt-free before David even bought an engagement ring. A fresh document had been filed just 30 days prior. It was a second mortgage, a massive high-interest loan taken out against the entire equity of my property. I downloaded the PDF and zoomed in on the signature line. There was my name flawlessly forged in blue ink right next to a fraudulent notary stamp. David had illegally leveraged my sanctuary, plunging me hundreds of thousands of dollars into debt to secure capital for his own phantom investments. If he defaulted, the bank would seize the roof over my head. He had literally gambled my shelter away while I was scheduling a tumor removal. Just as the crushing weight of that debt materialized on my screen, my phone vibrated sharply on the desk. The caller ID flashed David's face, a smiling photo taken during a summer boat trip we took last year. It was a text message. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a slow, dangerous rhythm. I unlocked the phone to read his words. The message dripped with a terrifying blend of arrogance and complete detachment from reality. He did not ask how my surgery went. He did not ask if my fever had broken or if I had food in the house. Instead, he wrote, "Caroline is annoyed you have not liked any of Mom's vacation photos. Stop being so bitter and antisocial just because you are stuck in bed. Try being supportive for once." Another message popped up a second later. "Besides, you should be thanking me. I am prepping the final pitch for Apex Holdings right now from the chalet. When I sign that contract next week, I am going to be the absolute king of my industry. You will never have to worry about money again. You are welcome." I read the two text messages over and over. The absolute delusion was breathtaking. He had stolen my savings, forged my signature, mortgaged my home, and abandoned me to bleed alone. Yet he genuinely believed he was the hero of this story. He honestly thought his upcoming corporate pitch would secure his throne. I slowly set the phone face down on the desk, a cold, sharp smile spreading across my face. David was staking his entire fraudulent empire on securing a massive financial contract with Apex Holdings. He thought Apex was just another faceless corporate investment trust run by a board of wealthy, untouchable executives. What he did not know, and what I had kept entirely separate from my marriage, was the true identity of the anonymous primary shareholder of that very trust. The glowing pixels on my phone screen seemed to burn directly into my retinas. I read David's arrogant text message a second time, then a third. He was bragging about prepping the final pitch for Apex Holdings from a luxury ski chalet. I was boasting that signing this contract next week would make him the absolute king of his industry, assuring me with sickening condescension that I would never have to worry about money again. A sharp, breathless sound escaped my lips. It started as a gasp of disbelief, but quickly morphed into a dark, echoing laugh that reverberated through the empty home office. The sudden movement pulled viciously at my fresh surgical incision, sending a bright flash of physical pain across my abdomen. I pressed a throw pillow hard against my stomach to brace the stitches, but I could not stop smiling. A chilling, razor-sharp smile slowly spread across my pale face, stretching from ear to ear. David had meticulously planned a flawless financial heist. He had drained my savings, forged my signature, mortgaged my house, and left me completely incapacitated so he could secure his glorious corporate future. He genuinely believed he was a master manipulator playing chess, while I was stuck playing checkers. But his fatal flaw was his own staggering ignorance. Apex Holdings was not just a random corporate investment firm. It was a massive private equity and wealth management trust. To the public, it was an impenetrable fortress of capital managed by a ruthless board of directors. What David did not know, what no one in his greedy, toxic family could have ever possibly imagined, was the true identity of the anonymous primary shareholder who controlled that very trust. My grandfather Thomas was a man who understood the darkest, most predatory corners of human greed. He was a self-made financial titan who built his empire during economic downturns, a man who trusted cold hard numbers far more than he ever trusted people. He was the one who nurtured my analytical mind and encouraged my career as a forensic accountant. He taught me how to read and dissect a corporate balance sheet before I was even old enough to apply for a driver license. When he passed away 8 years ago, he left behind a sprawling multi-billion-dollar financial empire. But he also left behind a highly specific set of legal instructions. The controlling shares of his primary asset management firm, Apex Holdings, were transferred entirely to me. However, the transfer was executed through a classified anonymous trust. The structure was an absolute masterpiece of legal engineering. It allowed me to retain total ownership and absolute veto power over every single major corporate decision, while a public-facing board of directors handled the daily public operations. To the outside world, Apex Holdings was a faceless corporate monolith. Nobody knew that a 32-year-old forensic accountant held the ultimate reins of power. I had kept my massive inheritance a complete secret from David since the day we met. I wanted to be absolutely certain that the man I married loved me for my mind and my heart, not for my staggering net worth. I presented myself simply as a hard-working professional, earning a comfortable, reliable salary. David accepted that narrative eagerly because it allowed his ego to thrive. He prided himself on being the primary breadwinner, constantly boasting about his sales commissions and his corporate bonuses. He viewed my career in forensic accounting as practical but unspectacular. He had absolutely no earthly idea that my personal net worth eclipsed his entire company valuation by a factor of 50. For the past 6 months, David had been utterly consumed with securing a massive partnership contract with Apex Holdings. I vividly remembered him standing in front of our master bathroom mirror late at night aggressively rehearsing his sales pitch. He would pace the bedroom floor complaining endlessly about the strict vetting processes of the Apex board members, cursing their demand for pristine financial collateral and flawless credit histories. I saw this deal as his golden ticket to the executive suite. If he secured the backing of Apex Holdings, his career would skyrocket. He would receive a massive promotion, a multi-million-dollar signing bonus, and the industry respect he desperately craved. He practically worshipped the ground the Apex executives walked on, constantly trying to network his way up their corporate ladder. The sheer, unadulterated irony of his text message washed over me like a tidal wave of cold clarity. He was sitting in a luxury ski chalet in Aspen, a vacation funded entirely by money he had stolen from my bank accounts. He was bragging to the woman he had abandoned bleeding on a hospital curb that he was about to become corporate royalty. He genuinely believed that his forged second mortgage and his web of shell companies had provided him with the perfect financial collateral to impress the Apex board. He thought he had outsmarted the system. He had no idea that the anonymous chairman of the board, the solitary figure who held the absolute power to approve or destroy his entire career, was the very wife he had just discarded like trash. My analytical mind rapidly connected the final pieces of his fraudulent puzzle. The massive second mortgage he had illegally taken out on my house by forging my signature was not just a way to funnel cash to his mother and sister. It was his collateral. The Apex board required a highly specific threshold of liquid assets and property equity for the partnership tier David was aggressively pursuing. He had leveraged my home to artificially inflate his personal financial portfolio. I was literally using my own stolen property to prove his worth to my own company. The circular audacity of his crime was almost impressive in its sheer stupidity. He had essentially handed me a perfectly documented confession of grand larceny neatly packaged within a corporate business proposal. The dull throb of my surgical wound faded entirely into the background, completely overridden by the icy precision of my professional training. I did not feel like a grieving wife mourning the sudden death of a marriage. I felt like an apex predator who had just watched her prey walk willingly into a steel cage and lock the door from the inside. I slowly set my personal phone down on the smooth oak surface of my desk. The screen went dark, but the blueprint for his absolute destruction was now glowing brightly in my mind. I closed out of the tracing software on my laptop, having successfully secured and encrypted all the raw banking data I needed. I reached into the hidden compartment of my briefcase and pulled out my secure work phone, a separate device David knew nothing about, used strictly for high-level corporate trust communications. I scrolled through my secure contacts until I found the exact name I needed: Attorney Mitchell. He was not just a standard family lawyer. He was a ruthless corporate litigator and the lead legal counsel for the Apex Holdings Trust. I pressed the call button and brought the phone to my ear, listening to the steady rhythmic dial tone. The chilling smile remained permanently fixed on my face. David wanted to play the high-stakes game of corporate kings, and I was about to show him exactly what happens when you try to steal from the house. The morning of the seventh day broke over Chicago with a bitter, biting frost turning the windows of my home office into sheets of opaque ice. But the atmosphere inside the room was entirely clinical, stripped of any lingering sorrow or shock. I sat upright at my heavy oak desk, dressed in a crisp, tailored blazer, worn over a soft blouse that carefully concealed the thick layers of medical bandages wrapping my abdomen. My posture was flawless. The intense physical agony from my recent tumor removal was locked away in a highly compartmentalized corner of my brain, suppressed by sheer willpower and a burning desire for absolute justice. I was no longer a wounded, abandoned spouse recovering on a cold floor. I was a corporate executive executing a hostile takeover of my own life. On the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop, a secure video conference was already well underway. Attorney Mitchell sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table in his downtown high-rise, flanked by 3 senior litigators and a top-tier risk management specialist from the Apex Holdings Trust. Their faces were grim, reflecting the severe gravity of the financial autopsy I had just presented to them. I shared my screen projecting the intricate forensic data maps I had spent the last 48 hours meticulously building despite my soaring fever. I walked them through every single illicit transaction with absolute precision. I showed them the dummy vendor invoices David had fabricated to drain my earnings, creating phantom businesses that only existed on paper. I highlighted the offshore routing numbers that funneled my hard-earned cash directly into the luxury lifestyle accounts of his mother, Barbara, and his sister, Caroline. The room of seasoned corporate lawyers sat in stunned silence as the sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over the digital connection. It was a textbook case of systematic embezzlement orchestrated by a man who believed his wife was too blind and too trusting to ever look at the ledgers. But the absolute masterpiece of his destruction was the forged second mortgage. I pulled up the high-resolution scan of the fraudulent loan document, zooming in closely on the falsified notary stamp and my perfectly copied signature at the bottom of the page. Mitchell leaned forward, adjusting his silver-framed glasses, a look of absolute predatory anticipation crossing his sharp features. He understood immediately what David had done. The fool had not just stolen from a wealthy wife to fund a ski trip. He had committed felony bank fraud to artificially inflate his portfolio for a corporate pitch to our own holding company. I did not shed a single tear as I laid out the mounting evidence. The embezzlement, the identity theft, and the grand larceny were no longer emotional wounds to be cried over. They were highly actionable offenses. I looked directly into the camera lens, meeting the eyes of my legal team, and issued my first directive. I ordered the immediate activation of the hidden financial clauses woven deeply into the fabric of my trust. With a few keystrokes from Mitchell's team, the ruthless counterattack began silently across the digital banking networks. First, we completely froze every single joint account tied to my Social Security number. The primary checking account David used for his daily lavish expenses, the shared credit lines he relied on to float his extravagant client dinners, the emergency savings he thought he had successfully drained. All of it was locked down instantly under a severe fraud investigation hold. Next, I formally revoked every single spousal credit guarantee I had ever signed on his behalf. David had always leveraged my pristine top-tier credit score to secure his high-end lifestyle. My financial backing was the only reason he drove an imported luxury sedan and carried premium travel cards in his wallet. Without my name propping him up, his personal credit rating was nothing more than a fragile house of cards waiting for a strong gust of wind. By the time he tried to buy his next round of drinks at the Aspen Ski Lodge, his plastic would be entirely useless, loudly and embarrassingly declined at the register. Then we moved to the central piece of the strategy, the upcoming corporate pitch. David truly believed he was walking into the Apex Holdings headquarters next week to secure a career-defining partnership. He thought he was going to dazzle a room full of anonymous executives with his artificially inflated portfolio and walk away with a multi-million-dollar contract that would make him the king of his industry. I instructed the risk management specialist to flag David's specific investment proposal in the Apex internal security system. The directive I gave was absolute. The board was not to cancel his meeting or turn him away at the lobby. They were to let him walk right through the front doors, set up his slick presentation, and lay out his fraudulent collateral for everyone in the room to see. But the executives sitting at that polished table would not be evaluating a potential business partner. They would be conducting a live in-person fraud audit. We were building a reinforced steel trap, and we were going to let his own towering arrogance serve as the perfect bait. Mitchell vigorously took notes, his legal team rapidly drafting the necessary corporate injunctions to execute my orders. The efficiency of boundless capital and top-tier legal representation is a beautiful thing to witness. Within 30 minutes, my husband had been completely financially neutralized, stripped of his stolen resources without a single alarm bell ringing on his end. He was still out there playing in the snow, blissfully unaware that his financial life support had just been brutally disconnected. But there was one final matter to address before I closed the laptop. The physical property itself, the very house I was currently sitting in. David firmly believed he had successfully mortgaged our marital home to secure his much-needed collateral. What he failed to comprehend, primarily because he was too arrogant to ever read the fine print of our property deeds, was the actual legal ownership structure of the real estate. When I purchased this sprawling house years ago, I did not buy it in my own personal name in order to protect my absolute anonymity. The property was legally owned by a subsidiary shell company, a corporate entity which was entirely controlled by the Apex Trust. By forging my signature on a massive secondary loan, David had not just committed a horrific act of domestic financial abuse. He had placed a fraudulent lien on a high-value corporate asset owned by a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. I looked at Mitchell through the screen, my voice dropping to a smooth, icy calm that belied the burning pain in my stomach. I instructed him to have the subsidiary holding company call in the fraudulent note immediately, because the secondary mortgage was secured through blatant identity theft and attached to a corporate asset without proper board approval. It triggered an automatic, irrevocable default clause. I was quietly transferring the ownership status of the physical house into a state of immediate, aggressive foreclosure. I was intentionally initiating the eviction process on my own property. The legal gears began grinding into motion before the video call even ended. The foreclosure notices would be expedited rapidly through the local courts, permanently stripping David of his legal right to reside on the premises. I was deliberately destroying the very ground he planned to return to, ensuring that the home he thought he had successfully stolen would soon become the exact site of his ultimate devastating humiliation. The digital storm I unleashed the previous day left no physical trace in the quiet corridors of my home. By the time the sun crept over the frost-covered Chicago skyline on the 8th day, the house remained as still as a tomb. My surgical wound throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but the fiery fever had completely subsided, replaced by a cold, calculating energy. I was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a cup of black tea, when the heavy thud of the front door unlocking broke the silence. Heavy footsteps echoed in the foyer. It was Martha. She had been our housekeeper for 4 years, a sharp, observant woman in her late 50s, who possessed an uncanny ability to read the unspoken dynamics of a household. She knew exactly how David spoke to me when he thought nobody was listening. She had seen the discarded receipts from his exorbitant lunches and quietly cleaned up the messes he carelessly left behind. Martha walked into the kitchen carrying her canvas tote bag, humming a soft tune that died instantly in her throat the moment she saw me. Her eyes dropped to my pale face, then to the thick medical-grade bandages visibly pressing against my blouse. She looked around the cavernous empty room, her confusion rapidly morphing into alarm. She knew my surgery had been scheduled for Tuesday. She knew David had taken a week off work specifically to care for me. "Melanie," Martha whispered, dropping her bag onto the floor. "Why are you sitting down here alone? Where is your husband?" I looked at her, my expression completely void of the fragile, accommodating wife she was used to serving. I invited her to sit on the stool across from me. I did not sugarcoat the reality. I told her everything in a calm, clinical voice. I explained how David had left me bleeding at the hospital discharge bay. I told her about the lockout, the stolen emergency funds, and the $15,000 luxury ski chalet he was currently enjoying with his mother and sister. I did not mention my hidden inheritance or the corporate execution I had just initiated, but I gave her enough of the truth to paint a crystal-clear picture of his absolute depravity. Martha sat frozen, her hands covering her mouth. The color drained from her face, quickly replaced by a flush of absolute, unadulterated fury. She had spent years folding David's designer shirts and polishing his imported shoes silently, enduring his arrogant, condescending remarks, because she needed the paycheck. But this revelation crossed a boundary of human decency that shook her to her core. "That selfish, arrogant boy!" Martha practically spat the words, her voice shaking with rage. "I always knew he was a snake in a tailored suit. The way he looked at himself in the mirror, the way he treated this home like a hotel. To leave you bleeding in the snow so he could go play in the mountains. Tell me what you need me to do, Melanie, because I am not lifting another finger for that man ever again." Her absolute, unwavering loyalty cemented the final phase of my strategy. I needed a proxy. I could not be here when David returned, but I needed someone I trusted implicitly to deliver the final crushing blow. "I am leaving today, Martha," I said, leaning forward and resting my hands flat on the cool marble counter. "But David thinks he is coming home tomorrow night to a desperate, bedridden wife. He expects to walk through that front door, toss his bags on the floor, and have his life continue exactly as he designed it. I need you to be the one waiting for him in the shadows." Martha did not hesitate. She nodded firmly, her dark eyes flashing with a shared sense of vengeance. I spent the next hour walking her through a highly specific, non-negotiable set of instructions for the following evening. I dictated exactly where she was to stand, what lights to leave off, and precisely what words she was to use when he demanded to know where I was. I warned her that his initial confusion would rapidly turn into a volatile tantrum, but she simply waved away my concern. She had raised 3 sons on her own and had zero fear of a coward throwing a tantrum. With the trap set, I pushed myself up from the kitchen stool and made my way upstairs to begin the final physical detachment from my marriage. The process of packing was grueling. Bending, lifting, and folding sent sharp warnings radiating from my stitches, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological liberation of wiping my slate clean. I brought a single black hardshell suitcase into the master bedroom. I did not touch the expensive designer dresses David had bought for me to wear to his corporate dinners, the garments he used to parade me around like a successful accessory. I left the expensive jewelry, the shared electronics, and every single item that had been purchased with commingled funds. I packed only what was undeniably, authentically mine. Comfortable clothes from before we met, my encrypted work laptop, a few cherished books, and the framed photograph of my late grandfather. Everything else was just collateral damage. I zipped the single suitcase shut, the metallic sound snapping with finality in the silent room. I stood in front of the large vanity mirror looking at my reflection. My skin was still pale and I looked visibly exhausted, but the terrified, dependent woman from Tuesday night was completely dead. I raised my left hand and looked at the heavy diamond ring sparkling on my ring finger. David had spent months bragging about the clarity and cut of this stone, treating it as a public receipt of his financial prowess. I gripped the diamond and slid the cold metal over my knuckle. It slipped off easily. I walked back downstairs to the kitchen, where Martha was waiting silently by the island. I placed the wedding ring right in the center of the dark marble counter. The small, sharp clink of the gold hitting the stone sounded like a gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. I reached into my leather work tote and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was sealed shut with a strip of tamper-evident red tape. Inside rested the culmination of my 72-hour corporate war. the fully executed divorce filings, the official termination of his employment guarantee, and the aggressive 30-minute eviction notice mandated by Apex Property Management. It was the physical manifestation of his complete and utter ruin. I handed the heavy envelope to Martha. She took it with both hands, feeling the substantial weight of the documents inside. She looked from the sealed package, down to the discarded diamond ring sitting lonely on the counter, then back up to my face. A profound, silent understanding passed between us. The house was no longer a home. It was a perfectly rigged explosive, and I had just handed her the detonator. Martha carefully tucked the heavy manila envelope into her canvas tote bag, her dark eyes locking with mine in a silent vow of solemnity. She quietly let herself out the back door, leaving me entirely alone in the cavernous kitchen. The heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place served as the starting gun for my final operation. I called it the Ghost Protocol. As a forensic accountant, I spent my entire career tracking the microscopic footprints people left behind. A misaligned receipt, a deleted email, a timestamp that did not match the official ledger. I knew exactly how much space a human being occupied in the digital and physical world. Erasing myself from this house required that same level of ruthless surgical precision. I was not just packing up and moving out. I was deliberately orchestrating a psychological void. I wanted David to return from his luxurious mountain getaway and step into a sterile, echoing museum of his own catastrophic failures. I started in the master bathroom. The physical pain from my abdominal incision was a constant burning reminder of my physical limits, but I moved with deliberate, measured steps. I opened the medicine cabinet and methodically cleared out every single item that belonged to me. My prescription bottles, my daily vitamins, my expensive face creams that David loved to brag about buying for me, despite using my credit card to do so. I threw them all into a heavy-duty trash bag. I took my toothbrush from the porcelain holder, leaving his solitary blue one leaning awkwardly against the glass. I wiped down the dual vanity sinks with harsh chemical bleach, scrubbing away any stray hairs, any smudges of my makeup, any lingering trace of my morning routine. I wanted the marble to gleam with a cold, uninviting perfection. I wanted the room to smell strictly of industrial disinfectant, completely masking the soft vanilla and cedar perfume I had worn for the entirety of our marriage. Moving into the massive walk-in closet, the disparity of our relationship became physically apparent. I had already packed my single black hard-shell suitcase with the few comfortable clothes and personal items I actually cared about. Now I systematically removed every empty velvet hanger from my side of the custom cabinetry. I gathered my winter boots, my running shoes, and the modest collection of handbags I had purchased for myself over the years. I shoved them into thick donation bags destined for a women's shelter across town. When I finished, my side of the closet was reduced to bare polished wood and empty chrome racks. The visual contrast was absolutely striking. David's extravagant tailored suits and expensive Italian leather shoes now sat isolated in the massive space, looking absurdly pretentious and entirely alone. He had spent years trying to fill the emotional void in his character with luxury fabrics. Now his wardrobe would hang in an echoing chamber of his own making. I moved methodically through the rest of the house, balancing my personal ledger to an absolute zero. I removed my favorite coffee mug from the kitchen cabinet. I packed away the specific brand of organic tea I drank every evening. I took down the framed degrees and professional certifications that had hung in the home office, leaving blank, unfaded rectangular patches on the painted drywall. Every space I touched was stripped of its warmth, its character, its soul. To complete the protocol, I walked through the living room and turned off the central heating system entirely. The fierce Chicago November wind was howling against the exterior siding. I opened the two large windows flanking the stone fireplace, just an inch allowing the freezing bitter air to slice into the room. The temperature inside began to drop rapidly. I wanted the physical climate of the house to perfectly match the emotional reality of our marriage. I wanted the cold to sink deeply into the hardwood floors and the leather furniture, so that when David walked through the front door, the chill would hit him right in the chest. I stood in the center of the dark living room, wrapped in my heavy winter coat, my black suitcase resting beside my boots. The silence in the house was absolute, broken only by the sharp whistling of the icy wind slipping through the cracked windows. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my personal cell phone. The screen illuminated the dark room, casting a pale glow across my face. I opened my text thread with David, his last message bragging about his upcoming contract with Apex Holdings and demanding that I stop acting like a needy wife, stared back at me in bold green bubbles. He was so incredibly certain of his victory. He was so completely blind to the guillotine poised directly above his neck. My fingers hovered over the digital keyboard. I did not type a long emotional paragraph. I did not hurl insults or demand apologies. Emotional reactions were a currency I absolutely refused to spend on him ever again. I kept it brief, clinical, and devastatingly precise. I typed, "You were right. I need to take care of myself." I hit send. The message delivered instantly. I did not wait for a read receipt. I immediately opened my phone settings and permanently blocked his number across all communication channels. Then, using the edge of one of my metal hairpins, I popped the SIM tray out of the side of the device. I extracted the tiny plastic square that connected me to his network, to his family, to the life I was permanently terminating. I walked over to the large stone fireplace. The grate was empty, dusted with the cold gray ashes of fires we had burned weeks ago. I tossed the small plastic SIM card directly onto the stone hearth. I struck a single long wooden match, touched the flame to the corner of a scrap piece of paper, and dropped it over the chip. I stood there in the freezing room and watched the plastic bubble blacken and melt into a toxic, unrecognizable lump. The digital bridge between us was completely incinerated. I grabbed the handle of my black suitcase and turned my back on the empty room. I walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind me. The heavy deadbolt engaged with a loud final click that echoed into the freezing night air. A sleek black town car was idling quietly at the curb, its headlights cutting through the falling sleet. The driver stepped out, opening the rear door for me without a single word. I climbed inside the warm leather interior, staring straight ahead as the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the frozen hollow shell of my former life disappearing into the rearview mirror. The black town car carried me away into the freezing Chicago night, leaving behind a perfectly constructed vacuum. 24 hours later, that vacuum swallowed my husband whole. I watched the high-definition security footage the following day, analyzing his return with the clinical detachment of a forensic auditor reviewing a corrupted bank ledger. It was early evening on the 9th day, when David's ride-share pulled up to the icy curb in front of the house. He stepped out of the vehicle looking deeply tanned, the aspen sun having baked a healthy, arrogant glow into his skin. He wore his expensive ski jacket open, entirely immune to the bitter city wind, after a week of relaxing in heated pools, getting private massages, and drinking premium spirits on my dime. In his right hand, he gripped his heavy leather duffel bag. In his left, he casually swung a small, brightly colored paper bag. It contained a cheap generic bottle of duty-free floral perfume he had hastily grabbed from an airport kiosk during his layover. It was his version of a get-well present, a transactional token meant to buy my silence smooth over his blatant abandonment and secure his dinner. He paused on the front walkway to check his cell phone. His thumb swiped across the screen, likely looking for a barrage of desperate, needy text messages from me begging for his attention. When he saw an empty notification screen, a smug smirk crossed his face. He pocketed the phone, clearly convinced that his strategy of ignoring me had successfully broken my spirit and taught me a lesson in compliance. He bounded up the front steps with the swagger of a man who believed the world owed him a permanent red carpet. He unlocked the heavy oak door and pushed it open, stepping boldly into the foyer. He fully expected to be hit by a wave of comforting central heating. The smell of roasted garlic and herbs emanating from the kitchen, and the sight of a fragile, accommodating wife waiting anxiously on the sofa to ask about his trip. He intended to drop his bags hand over the cheap perfume and complain endlessly about how exhausting first-class air travel was, while I poured him a glass of scotch and listened to his fabricated stories of corporate meetings. Instead, the house greeted him with the physical hostility of a commercial meat locker. The temperature inside was barely above freezing. His breath plumed into a thick white cloud of vapor the moment he crossed the threshold. He paused, his designer boots scuffing against the hardwood floor. The sound was entirely wrong. It echoed sharply, bouncing off the walls with a hollow metallic resonance that only exists in completely vacant spaces. He frowned, the relaxed vacation demeanor instantly melting away into sharp annoyance. He dropped his duffel bag onto the floor. The heavy thud traveled uninterrupted up the main staircase, amplifying in the empty air. He flipped the light switch in the hallway, but the warm, inviting glow he expected illuminated nothing but bare surfaces and sterile perfection. He walked toward the living room, increasingly irritated by the freezing draft cutting through his expensive jacket. He noticed the cracked windows flanking the stone fireplace, the icy sleet piling up on the interior sill. The grate was completely dead, holding only the bizarre blackened lump of melted plastic where my old SIM card used to be. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the empty walls. The spaces where my framed professional certifications used to hang were now just pale blank rectangles against the paint. The decorative throw pillows I had carefully chosen were missing. The side tables were stripped of their books and photographs. The entire space had been clinically scrubbed of my existence. But David did not suspect a financial execution. His narcissism was far too dense to allow for the possibility that he had been outsmarted, let alone outmaneuvered by the woman he considered a blind, easily manipulated cash cow. He simply assumed I was throwing a massive theatrical tantrum. He thought the freezing house, the open windows, and the missing decorations were just the desperate, petty actions of a neglected spouse trying to make a dramatic point. He processed the stark emptiness not as an evacuation, but as a temporary inconvenience designed to punish him for his trip. His irritation boiled over into outright anger. His face twisted into an ugly, entitled scowl. How dare I make his homecoming so uncomfortable? How dare I refuse to have the house warm and dinner waiting when he was just days away from pitching the apex deal? He was a man on the verge of becoming corporate royalty, and he felt utterly disrespected by this frozen, silent rebellion. He dropped the duty-free bag onto the glass coffee table with a harsh smack. He marched aggressively toward the kitchen, expecting to find me pouting in the dark. He pushed open the heavy swinging door, his heavy footsteps ringing out like gunshots on the marble tile. Finding the kitchen just as dark and empty as the rest of the house, he took a deep breath, his chest puffing out with absolute authority. He yelled for our housekeeper at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing violently off the stone countertops, demanding to know where his dramatic attention-seeking wife was hiding. David's voice bounced off the bare walls, harsh and demanding. He shouted Martha's name again, the sound slicing through the bitter chill of the living room. He expected her to come scurrying out of the hallway, apologizing profusely for the freezing temperature and scrambling to turn on the furnace. He stood in the center of the stripped room, his expensive ski jacket zipped tight against the biting draft, his face flushed with a mixture of sunburn and mounting fury. Footsteps finally sounded from the direction of the kitchen. They were not the hurried, anxious steps of an employee eager to please. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. Martha stepped out of the shadows and into the dim light of the foyer. She was fully dressed in her heavy wool winter coat, a thick scarf wrapped securely around her neck, and her canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder. She did not look like a woman in the middle of a cleaning shift. She looked like a woman who was clocking out for the last time. David glared at her, pointing an accusing finger toward the open, icy windows. He demanded to know what was going on. He asked if Melanie had lost her mind, complaining that he had just flown halfway across the country after a grueling business trip, only to find his home treated like a meat locker. He ordered Martha to shut the windows, turn up the thermostat, and tell him exactly which room his dramatic wife was hiding in, so he could put an end to this ridiculous tantrum. Martha did not move toward the windows. She did not reach for the thermostat. She simply stood her ground, her dark eyes locking onto his with an expression of absolute, unfiltered disgust. She looked at him not as her employer, but as a pathetic, transparent coward. She walked slowly toward the small glass table in the foyer, the only piece of furniture I had deliberately left behind in that space. She reached into her canvas tote bag and pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope sealed with bright red tamper-evident tape. David stopped mid-rant, his brow furrowing as he stared at the package. He asked what she was holding. Martha did not answer immediately. She lifted the envelope and dropped it flat onto the glass table. The heavy slap of the paper hitting the surface echoed sharply in the freezing air. "Your wife?" Martha asked, her voice dripping with an icy indifference that matched the temperature of the room. "The owner of this property left yesterday. She asked me to give you this." David let out a scoff of disbelief, shaking his head at the sheer absurdity of the statement. He stepped forward, reaching for the envelope while muttering about how I was taking this childish game entirely too far. He gripped the edge of the red security tape and ripped it backward. The harsh tearing sound filled the quiet space. Martha did not wait to watch him read. She adjusted the strap of her tote bag, turned her back on him, and walked straight out the front door, pulling it firmly shut behind her. David was left entirely alone in the freezing foyer. He pulled the thick stack of premium legal paper from the envelope. He expected a melodramatic letter, perhaps a list of furious demands, or a printout of the Aspen photos, accompanied by angry threats. He expected something he could easily manipulate, something fueled by the desperate emotions he believed I still harbored for him. He flipped to the first document. It was a formal petition for dissolution of marriage. My signature was already executed at the bottom, crisp, clinical, and legally binding. There was no attached letter, no demand for counseling, no request for an explanation. It was an absolute non-negotiable termination of our union. A nervous knot formed in David's stomach, but his arrogance tried to suppress it. He assumed this was just a bluff, a high-stakes intimidation tactic. He flipped to the second set of documents, expecting a list of financial demands he could easily negotiate away using the secret funds he thought were safely hidden in his offshore accounts. Instead, he found a comprehensive notice of revocation. It was a legally binding injunction stripping him of every single spousal credit guarantee, immediately severing his access to all joint accounts, and formally dissolving his authorization on my financial portfolio. A separate page detailed the automatic default of the fraudulent secondary mortgage he had taken out in my name, citing blatant forgery and identity theft. His breathing turned shallow. The healthy, arrogant glow from the Aspen sun began to drain rapidly from his face. He realized in real time that his hidden labyrinth of shell accounts had been completely excavated. His secret financial empire had been entirely dismantled while he was sipping champagne in a hot tub. But the true world-shattering devastation was waiting on the very last page of the stack. David pulled the final document forward. The heavy cardstock bore a highly familiar, terrifyingly prestigious corporate letterhead. It was the official logo of Apex Holdings. He stared at the emblem, his mind struggling to comprehend how my personal legal envelope contained official correspondence from the massive corporate trust he was scheduled to pitch to the following morning. He read the bold capitalized text at the top of the page. Notice of immediate eviction and asset seizure. The document outlined that the property he was currently standing in was legally owned by a subsidiary of the Apex Holdings Trust. It stated that due to his commission of felony bank fraud and the placement of an illegal lien on a corporate asset, his right to reside on the premises was permanently revoked. Then his eyes dropped to the signature line at the bottom of the eviction notice. It was not signed by an anonymous board member. It was signed by the primary shareholder and ultimate owner of Apex Holdings. It was signed by me. The words blurred together as the catastrophic reality violently realigned his entire universe. His wife was not a naive mid-level forensic accountant. His wife was the anonymous billionaire who controlled the exact corporation he had staked his entire future on. He had stolen from his own prospective boss. He had committed grand larceny against the very empire he was trying to infiltrate. The physical reaction was instantaneous. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation hit his nervous system like a freight train. The document slipped from his trembling hands, scattering across the cold glass table and fluttering down to the hardwood floor. David staggered backward, his chest heaving as he desperately gasped for air in the freezing room. His legs gave out completely. His knees violently buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the icy floor, surrounded by the scattered evidence of his absolute and total ruin. David remained on the icy hardwood floor for several long minutes, his chest heaving as his brain fiercely rejected the reality printed on the heavy cardstock. For a narcissist of his caliber, absolute defeat is an impossible concept to digest. Denial quickly mutated into blind, irrational rage. He snatched the eviction notice from the floor, crushing the premium paper in his fist, and scrambled awkwardly to his feet. He lunged for the front door, throwing his weight against the heavy oak and ripping it open to the freezing night air. I expected to find Martha walking down the driveway so he could unleash his fury upon her. He stepped out onto the frost-covered porch, the bitter November wind immediately slicing through his open ski jacket, and began to scream into the darkness. He shouted that the documents were completely fake. He roared that he legally owned half of the property, that he was the man of the house, and that any judge in the city would laugh this pathetic eviction attempt out of court. I demanded that Martha come back and turn on the furnace before he had her arrested for trespassing. His hysterical tantrum was abruptly cut short. Heavy, authoritative footsteps crunched against the icy walkway. Emerging from the shadows of the street were not the retreating steps of a terrified housekeeper. The blinding glare of two heavy-duty tactical flashlights hit David squarely in the face, forcing him to shield his eyes. As his vision adjusted, the flashing red and blue lights of a Chicago police cruiser illuminated the falling sleet. Two massive armed private security contractors, wearing dark tactical gear, marched up the front steps. They were flanked by two uniformed city police officers. The lead security contractor, a towering man with a completely impassive expression, stepped directly onto the porch and held up a clipboard bearing the Apex Holdings corporate seal. He did not ask how David was doing. He did not care about the aspen ton or the expensive ski jacket. He looked at David as nothing more than an unauthorized squatter on a high-value commercial asset. The contractor informed him that they were executing an immediate aggressive eviction order mandated by Apex Property Management due to flagged felony bank fraud. David stammered, his arrogant bravado instantly dissolving into panic. He tried to deploy his usual salesman charm, putting his hands up defensively and attempting to explain to the police officers that this was just a massive misunderstanding. He claimed it was merely a domestic dispute, a bitter disagreement with his wife, and that he had every legal right to be inside his own home. The older police officer stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. He informed David that the property was legally registered to a corporate holding company, not a private citizen. He explained that my legal team had already provided the precinct with the verified expedited court orders confirming the fraudulent mortgage. According to the law, David had zero marital claim to the physical real estate. He was legally trespassing on corporate property, and if he did not comply immediately, he would be arrested on the spot. The absolute finality in the officer's voice shattered the last of David's delusions. The security contractors did not give him time to argue. They pushed past him into the freezing foyer, their heavy boots tracking snow onto the pristine hardwood. They informed David he had exactly 10 minutes to gather his immediate personal belongings and vacate the premises. David practically ran up the stairs, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He rushed into the master bedroom, expecting to grab his expensive leather luggage to pack his tailored suits. But my ghost protocol had been thorough. The luggage was gone. Everything was gone. One of the security contractors followed him into the closet, his face utterly blank. Reaching into his tactical vest, the contractor pulled out a heavy-duty black plastic garbage bag and tossed it onto the floor at David's feet. The visual poetry was staggering. A man who defined his entire self-worth by luxury brands and corporate prestige was being forced to pack his life into a literal trash bag. David frantically grabbed whatever he could. He shoved his custom Italian shoes, a few wrinkled dress shirts, and his expensive watches into the plastic bag, his hands shaking violently from the cold and the adrenaline. The contractor tapped his watch, announcing that time was up. David tried to beg for just 5 more minutes to find his passport and his secondary banking documents. The security team ignored his pleas completely. They grabbed him by the arms of his ski jacket and physically escorted him down the staircase, matching his frantic, stumbling pace with their rigid professional march. They pushed him out the front door and onto the icy porch. The lead contractor pulled the heavy oak door shut. The loud, definitive click of the newly installed digital deadbolt engaging echoed over the howling wind. David stumbled down the front steps, his designer boots slipping on the frozen concrete. He caught his balance just before hitting the ground, the black garbage bag swinging heavily against his leg. The police officers ordered him to leave the property boundaries immediately or face detainment. He dragged his feet to the edge of the sidewalk, the freezing sleet matting his hair to his forehead and soaking through his clothes. He stood shivering violently under the pale glow of the street lamp, staring back at the dark, impenetrable fortress that used to be his kingdom. He was completely locked out, stripped of his resources, and standing alone in the biting winter storm. It was the exact, undeniable mirror image of the traumatic condition he had callously left me to suffer through just 9 days prior. The icy Chicago wind whipped mercilessly off Lake Michigan, slicing straight through the expensive, unzipped ski jacket David wore. He stumbled down the slick, heavily salted pavement, his custom Italian leather boots entirely unequipped for the aggressive, freezing slush. The black plastic garbage bag slung over his shoulder bumped heavily against his leg with every erratic step. The sheer weight of his custom-tailored suits, imported cologne, and heavy luxury watches strained the cheap plastic, threatening to tear open and spill his remaining dignity directly onto the frozen concrete. He found temporary refuge beneath the plexiglass overhang of a city bus stop. The shelter offered absolutely no warmth, merely a shield from the horizontal sleet. The digital clock on a nearby bank building glowed in piercing red numbers. 2 o'clock in the morning. He huddled on the freezing metal bench, his teeth chattering violently. His mind scrambled frantically to process the catastrophic shift in his reality. He still fiercely refused to believe he was ruined. His towering ego convinced him that the eviction notice and the frozen accounts were simply a massive, aggressive legal overreach by a bitter, vindictive wife. He assumed it was a temporary freeze, a bureaucratic hurdle he could easily clear once the banks opened their doors, and he could deploy his usual aggressive charm. He just needed a warm bed for the night. Just 3 blocks away stood the grand illuminated entrance of the Wellington Hotel, an ultra-luxury establishment, where he frequently took potential clients for high-end dinners using my pristine credit lines. He hoisted the garbage bag over his shoulder and marched determinedly toward the glowing revolving doors. He fully intended to book their premium corner suite, order hot room service, and sleep off this absurd nightmare in a king-sized bed. He pushed through the heavy glass doors, stepping out of the brutal winter storm and into the heavily perfumed, heavily heated lobby. The sudden contrast in temperature was physically jarring. The thick snow melting off his expensive ski jacket dripped loudly onto the polished marble floor, creating dirty gray puddles around his boots. A bellhop in a crisp, tailored uniform took one look at the soaked, shivering man dragging a trash bag and immediately took a defensive step backward. David completely ignored the stares. He marched directly to the front desk, slapping his bare hand against the mahogany counter with his usual entitled authority. He demanded the best available suite for the night, speaking to the night clerk with the sharp, condescending tone he reserved exclusively for anyone working in the service industry. The night clerk, a thoroughly professional young man, maintained a polite but visibly tight expression. He requested a credit card for the incidental deposit and the nightly room rate. David reached into his damp pocket and produced a sleek, heavy metal premium travel card. It was a card tied directly to an account I had unilaterally severed hours earlier. He tossed the metal card onto the counter with a loud, arrogant clack. The clerk inserted the chip into the terminal. The machine processed for exactly 3 seconds before letting out a sharp, abrasive beep. The screen flashed a bright red warning. The clerk looked up, his tone dropping an octave. He quietly informed David that the card had been loudly and decisively declined. David scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. He blamed the freezing weather for damaging the magnetic chip and blamed the bank for triggering a false fraud alert due to his recent overseas travel to Aspen. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a secondary platinum card, sliding it aggressively across the polished wood. The clerk swiped it through the reader. Another sharp, unforgiving beep echoed through the quiet, opulent lobby. Declined. David's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. His arrogant facade began to crack under the weight of public humiliation. He began raising his voice loudly, insisting that his personal net worth was higher than the entire hotel operating budget. He demanded the clerk try running the numbers manually, slamming his fist against the desk. A few late-night guests sitting in the lobby lounge turned their heads, their eyes lingering on the disheveled shouting man clutching a garbage bag. He produced a third card, a standard corporate visa he kept for emergencies. The terminal rejected it instantly with the exact same shrill beep. Every single financial lifeline he possessed had been completely incinerated. The night clerk pushed the useless plastic cards back across the marble counter. His professional courtesy evaporated entirely. He informed David that without a valid form of payment, he absolutely could not process a reservation. Furthermore, he explicitly noted that David was dripping dirty street slush all over the imported marble floor and actively disrupting the peace of the lobby. The clerk caught the eye of a burly security guard standing near the elevators and gave a subtle nod. The guard approached immediately, his hand resting firmly on his radio, and politely but firmly asked David to leave the premises. The humiliation was absolute and paralyzing. A man who considered himself corporate royalty, a man who believed he was untouchable, was being physically escorted out of a hotel lobby like a common vagrant. David was thrust back out through the revolving doors, stumbling onto the frozen pavement as the heavy glass locked securely into place behind him. The bitter wind bit mercilessly into his face, instantly freezing the damp tracks of melted snow on his cheeks. He retreated to a frozen iron bench across the street, exactly mirroring the traumatic condition he had callously left me to suffer through just 9 days prior. His teeth clattered together so violently his jaw physically ached. He pulled out his cell phone. The battery icon flashed a dire 5% warning. His vast web of shell accounts, his stolen emergency bonds, and his forged mortgage collateral were utterly useless to him out here in the freezing dark. He had absolutely zero liquid cash to his name. With trembling, numb fingers, he opened his contacts. His pride had been completely shattered, leaving only a raw, desperate survival instinct. He tapped the dial button on the only lifeline he had left. He called his mother, Barbara, praying she would answer her phone at 3 in the morning so he could beg her to pay for a cheap motel room or let him sleep on her living room couch. The dial tone hummed against his frozen ear, each second stretching into an agonizing eternity. When Barbara finally answered the call, her voice was not laced with maternal concern. It was sharp, heavily defensive, and completely devoid of warmth. "David," she snapped before he could even explain his desolate surroundings. "Do you have any earthly idea what time it is? And more importantly, do you have any idea what your hysterical wife just did?" David shivered violently, pulling his unzipped ski jacket tighter against the brutal wind. "Mom, listen to me. I am locked out. My cards are entirely frozen. I am sitting on a metal bench in the middle of a blizzard. I need you to pay for a hotel room or let me come sleep on your couch." A harsh, bitter laugh echoed through the speaker. It was not Barbara. Caroline had grabbed the phone, having clearly been awake and pacing the floor alongside their mother. "Are you out of your mind?" Caroline shouted, her shrill voice cutting directly through the howling weather. "You want to sleep on our couch? My luxury SUV was just targeted for repossession 3 hours ago. Mom's platinum card was loudly declined at the airport lounge in front of half our social circle. We had to humiliate ourselves and beg a friend to cover our excess luggage fees just to fly home. Caroline, please." David begged, his teeth clanking together so hard his jaw ached. "I just need a warm place to stay for one single night." "You had one job," Barbara interrupted, her tone dripping with absolute venom. "You were supposed to keep that woman happy. She was our cash cow, David. You promised me you had her completely under control. Now all our credit lines are severed, the collection agencies are already leaving voicemails, and you expect us to open our doors to you. I do not have room for a loser who cannot even manage his own household." "Mom, I am your son," David pleaded, his voice breaking under the weight of the rejection. "You are a massive liability," Caroline spat. "Do not call us until you fix this ridiculous mess you created." The line went dead. The digital screen of his phone flickered, flashed a dire low battery warning, and faded to completely black. David stared at the useless brick of technology in his hand. The women he had stolen for the family he had relentlessly funded by mortgaging his own marriage had discarded him the absolute second the money stopped flowing. Their love was entirely transactional, and his account was officially overdrawn. Desperation overrode his paralyzing shock. He shoved his frozen phone into his pocket and flagged down a passing off-duty taxi. He lied to the exhausted driver, promising a massive cash tip if he took him to the affluent suburb of Oak Park. He planned to force his way into Caroline's sprawling house. He knew Jamal, his brother-in-law, would be too level-headed and compassionate to let family freeze on the street. The taxi pulled up to the pristine, snow-covered driveway of Caroline's residence. David bolted from the cab, completely ignoring the angry shouts of the unpaid driver behind him, and sprinted up the front steps. He pounded his frozen fists against the heavy mahogany door, his plastic garbage bag slapping wildly against his leg. The deadbolt clicked. The door swung open, revealing the imposing frame of Jamal. The brilliant trauma surgeon stood in his dark green hospital scrubs, having clearly just returned from an exhausting life-saving shift. Jamal's face was not welcoming. It was carved from solid stone, radiating an intense, quiet fury that made David instinctively take a step backward. "Jamal, thank God!" David gasped, pushing his shoulder forward in an attempt to bypass his brother-in-law and enter the warm foyer. "Caroline is being completely irrational. Let me inside. I am freezing to death." Jamal did not budge a single inch. He planted his heavy boots firmly on the threshold, forming an impenetrable human wall. He looked down at David, his dark eyes analyzing the pathetic, shivering man clutching a trash bag. "Melanie called me days ago," Jamal said, his deep voice vibrating with absolute disgust. "She did not ask for anything. She just wanted to let me know the collateral damage was coming, and she apologized that I had to be married into this toxic family." "She is crazy!" David stammered, his breath clouding in the bitter air. "She changed the locks. She completely overreacted." "She overreacted." Jamal stepped forward, his imposing stature forcing David to retreat dangerously close to the icy edge of the porch. "I spend my entire life in emergency rooms, David. I pull people back from the brink of death. And you left your wife bleeding through her surgical bandages so you could go drink champagne in a hot tub with money you stole from her." David opened his mouth to argue, to deploy his usual slick corporate charm, but Jamal cut him off with a lethal glare. "You are a coward and a parasite," Jamal stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He reached out, grabbed the black plastic garbage bag dangling from David's shoulder, and ripped it away. He hurled the bag violently off the porch. It crashed into a heavily snowed-in rosebush, tearing open and spilling David's custom Italian dress shirts directly into the freezing slush. "Do not ever step foot on my property again," Jamal warned, pointing a steady finger at David's chest. "If you knock on this door one more time, I will not call the police. I will handle you myself." The heavy mahogany door slammed shut. The deadbolt engaged with a loud final echo. David was utterly stranded. He stumbled off the porch, wading through the deep snow to retrieve his ruined designer clothes. As he shoved the soaked, freezing fabrics back into the torn plastic bag, his eyes landed on his old secondary sedan, parked at the edge of the driveway. He had left it there before taking a premium rideshare to the airport 10 days ago. He rushed to the car and pulled the spare manual key from the inner pocket of his ski jacket. He unlocked the door and threw himself into the driver's seat. The leather upholstery was like sitting on a block of solid ice. He jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered, clicked, and remained completely dead, the battery entirely drained by the brutal Chicago winter. There was no heat. There was no escape. He was trapped in a freezing metal box on the side of a suburban street. David curled his knees to his chest, wrapping the torn garbage bag and his ruined damp dress shirts around his shivering shoulders in a desperate, pathetic attempt to preserve his body heat. His teeth clattered rhythmically in the pitch-black cabin. Yet, as the agonizing hours of the early morning crawled by, his blinding narcissism refused to completely die. He stared at the digital clock on the frozen dashboard. He clung to the one single lifeline he had left in this world. The 10 o'clock morning meeting at the towering headquarters of Apex Holdings. He visualized the massive, polished boardroom. He convinced his freezing, desperate mind that the anonymous board of directors would instantly recognize his unparalleled corporate genius. He hallucinated a scenario where he would deliver the pitch of a lifetime, secure a multi-million-dollar signing bonus by noon, and use the massive cash advance to utterly destroy Melanie in divorce court. He just needed to survive until the sun came up, completely unaware that the sun was about to illuminate the site of his absolute final execution. The brutal morning sun pierced through the frosted windshield of the dead sedan, stinging David's bloodshot eyes. He had survived the freezing Chicago night huddled under a torn plastic garbage bag, his teeth rattling so violently his jaw felt fractured. Every muscle in his body screamed in stiff, agonizing protest as he forced himself to sit up. The luxury Italian dress shirts he had salvaged from the slush were stiff with ice. He dug through the glove compartment with numb fingers and miraculously found a crumpled $50 bill tucked beneath an old registration manual. It was just enough to catch a city cab downtown. He stripped off his damp ski jacket and forced his shivering arms into a severely wrinkled, custom-tailored suit jacket. He ran his freezing hands through his matted hair, attempting to smooth it down using the rearview mirror. He looked completely disheveled, a pathetic shadow of his usual polished self. Yet the towering delusion in his mind remained entirely intact. He genuinely believed that the moment he walked into the corporate headquarters of Apex Holdings, his undeniable charisma would instantly overshadow his wrinkled clothes. The taxi dropped him off in the heart of the financial district. The Apex Holdings building was a monolithic structure of dark reflective glass and steel that dominated the city skyline. It was an impenetrable fortress of wealth. David pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the expansive heated marble lobby. He approached the pristine front desk, fully expecting the security guards to question his unkempt appearance. He squared his shoulders, projecting his chest outward, and stated his name with aggressive authority. He announced that he had a 10 o'clock executive pitch with the board of directors. The receptionist did not ask a single question. She did not even ask for his identification. She simply pressed a button beneath her desk, unlocking the private executive elevator bank. She instructed him to proceed directly to the top floor. David smirked as he walked away. He interpreted this frictionless entry as a sign of his immense corporate importance. He had absolutely no idea that he was not being welcomed as a respected business partner. He was being ushered straight into a meticulously designed financial slaughterhouse. The high-speed elevator shot upward, swallowing the floors in absolute silence. David stared at his reflection in the polished brass doors. He adjusted his crooked silk tie and rolled his shoulders back, actively suppressing his physical exhaustion. He silently rehearsed his opening lines, convincing himself that he held the winning hand. He was about to ask for a massive line of credit leveraging the fraudulent second mortgage he had taken out on my property. He planned to use the multi-million-dollar advance to completely bypass his current frozen accounts rescue his mother and sister from their sudden debt and hire the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the state to crush me. The elevator chimed softly. The brass doors slid open, revealing the highly restricted executive level. A silent, impeccably dressed assistant was waiting for him. She did not offer a greeting. She simply turned on her heel and led him down a wide, silent corridor, lined with modern art and frosted glass partitions. She stopped in front of a massive set of double oak doors and pushed them open, gesturing for him to step inside. The Apex Holdings boardroom was overwhelmingly intimidating. It was a cavernous space dominated by a massive custom-built mahogany table that stretched 30 feet across the room. Seated along the edges were 12 senior executives. They wore tailored dark suits and maintained an atmosphere of chilling, absolute silence. Nobody stood up to greet him. Nobody offered a polite handshake or a cup of coffee. They simply stared at him with cold, calculating expressions. The sheer intensity of their collective gaze would have sent any normal person running for the exit. But David, fueled by pure, unadulterated narcissism, interpreted their stony silence as a captive audience waiting to be dazzled. He walked to the presenter podium at the end of the table and unzipped his leather portfolio. As he arranged his documents, his eyes drifted to the opposite end of the mahogany table. Sitting at the very head of the boardroom was the chairman's seat. It was a massive, high-backed chair upholstered in premium black leather. The chair was turned completely away from the table, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding panoramic view of the frozen Chicago skyline. The person sitting in it remained perfectly still, their identity entirely concealed by the high leather backing. David cleared his throat, flashing his signature million-dollar sales smile. He launched into his presentation with aggressive enthusiasm. He spoke loudly, his voice echoing off the glass walls as he laid out his market projections and his aggressive expansion strategies. He marched through his slide deck boasting about his supposed massive personal equity and his pristine asset portfolio. He spoke of the commercial real estate he supposedly leveraged for this partnership, completely ignoring the fact that he had forged my signature to obtain that exact collateral. About 5 minutes into his presentation, he paused. He knew these executives were thorough. He knew they ran aggressive real-time background checks on all potential partners. He assumed that by now their risk management software might have flagged the sudden freeze on his credit accounts or the brand new foreclosure status on his residential collateral. He decided to play the ultimate defensive card. He decided to address the financial anomaly by deploying his favorite tactic. He played the victim. He leaned against the podium, dropping his voice into a tone of manufactured apologetic sincerity. He looked directly at the silent executives and let out a heavy theatrical sigh. He acknowledged that their preliminary audits might show some temporary unusual activity on his personal accounts over the last 24 hours. He waved his hand dismissively, putting on a brave, long-suffering smile. I explicitly told the board that they had absolutely nothing to worry about regarding his financial stability. He leaned into the microphone and confidently explained that any minor credit hiccups were simply the unfortunate byproduct of an ugly impending divorce. He stated loudly and clearly that his assets were temporarily tied up because he was currently dealing with a mentally unstable, unemployed, soon-to-be ex-wife. The silence in the cavernous boardroom stretched to an absolute breaking point. The 12 senior executives sitting along the mahogany table did not offer a single nod of sympathy. They did not murmur in understanding at his pitiful excuse. Instead, as if orchestrated by a silent conductor, every single head in the room turned uniformly toward the far end of the table. The massive high-backed black leather chair slowly began to swivel. The frictionless glide of the heavy mechanism felt deafening in the pin-drop quiet of the room. The morning sun pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast a dramatic silhouette as the chair completed its rotation. I sat there perfectly centered at the head of the table. I was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal gray power suit that commanded absolute authority. My hair was styled flawlessly, my posture was rigid and unbroken, and my expression was a mask of cold, vibrant power. The fragile, bleeding woman he had abandoned in the freezing snow was entirely gone. I was utterly unfazed, looking down the length of the table, directly into the eyes of the man who thought he had destroyed me. David physically lost his breath. A loud, pathetic gasp escaped his throat. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked practically translucent. He stumbled backward, his custom Italian leather shoes skidding against the polished floor. His hips slammed hard against the edge of the presenter podium, the only thing keeping his trembling legs from giving out completely. His jaw went slack, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, as his brain violently rejected the visual information it was processing. I let him drown in the suffocating silence for 10 agonizing seconds. I watched the arrogant, aspen-tanned corporate king shatter into a million jagged pieces. I leaned forward slightly, resting my manicured hands flat on the cool mahogany. When I finally spoke, my voice was smooth, resonant, and dripping with razor-sharp precision. "You were saying something about my mental instability, David." He tried to speak. He desperately tried to form a coherent sentence, but his vocal cords completely betrayed him. A pathetic, strangled squeak was the only sound he managed to produce. His eyes darted wildly around the room, looking at the 12 stoic executives, then back to me, silently begging for this to be a hallucination. "I must admit," I continued, my tone conversational, but carrying the lethal weight of an executioner. "When I reviewed the partnership proposal you submitted to my firm, I was deeply intrigued by your confidence. You walked into this building seeking our capital. You promised my board of directors pristine collateral, unparalleled market integrity, and absolute financial transparency." I paused, tilting my head slightly. "But since you felt the need to bring up my unemployment to the very people who work for me, I think it is only fair that we review your actual resume." "Melanie," he finally choked out, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I am working, David," I replied coldly. "I am the primary shareholder and active chairman of the board for the Apex Holdings Trust. You are standing in my building. You are pitching to my employees. and you are attempting to secure a multi-million-dollar line of credit using property that my corporation legally owns. The sheer gravity of the revelation hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning stark white as he visibly hyperventilated. The man who had mocked my career, who had treated my forensic accounting firm as a trivial hobby, was now realizing that I sat at the absolute pinnacle of the financial food chain he so desperately worshipped. "No," he stammered, shaking his head frantically. "No, this is a mistake. The accounts, the freeze, that was you. Every single action was me." I confirmed, my voice carrying zero marital affection. "You arrogantly assumed you could outsmart the system. You thought you could operate a shadow economy right under my nose, funneling my hard-earned wealth to fund your family's delusions of grandeur. You believed you were a mastermind playing chess." I picked up a small, sleek digital remote resting on the table next to my portfolio. "But you forgot one crucial detail, David. I track financial fraud for a living, and your ledgers were astonishingly sloppy." "Melanie, please," he begged, lifting a trembling hand toward me. His corporate facade was completely annihilated. He was shrinking in front of the entire executive board, reduced to a desperate, terrified imposter. "We can talk about this. We are husband and wife. You do not have to do this in front of them." "We ceased being husband and wife the second you left me to bleed out on a hospital curb," I stated, my voice echoing off the glass walls with absolute finality. "Today, this is strictly business." With a single decisive tap of my thumb against the remote button, I bypassed his slick, fabricated slide deck. The massive high-definition digital screens wrapping the entire back wall of the boardroom flared to brilliant life. The pristine corporate graphics vanished, instantly replaced by the exhaustive granular forensic audit of his entire existence. The screens filled with glaring red data points, highlighted routing numbers, and damning transaction histories. I projected every single cent he had embezzled, the dummy vendor invoices he created to steal my earnings, the offshore wire transfers funneling cash directly into Barbara and Caroline's luxury accounts, the itemized $15,000 receipt for the Aspen ski chalet, complete with the timestamp proving he booked it while I was scheduling my tumor removal. But the centerpiece of the digital display, dominating the largest screen in the center of the room, was the high-resolution scan of the fraudulent secondary mortgage. It was magnified to show the forged signature and the illegal notary stamp, presenting irrefutable, perfectly documented proof of his felony bank fraud. I sat back in my high leather chair, crossing my arms as the undeniable evidence of his grand larceny washed over the room in bright, condemning light. I was exposing every single thing he had forged, stolen, and desperately tried to hide right there for the entire corporate world to see. David's eyes darted wildly across the towering digital displays. The red ink of his fraudulent transactions painted his face in a harsh, condemning glow. For a fraction of a second, his brain short-circuited, unable to process the absolute destruction of his meticulously crafted reality. Then his survival instinct kicked in, fueled by a lifetime of narcissism and manipulation. He gripped the edge of the mahogany podium, his knuckles turning stark white, and forced a strained, frantic laugh that echoed terribly in the cavernous boardroom. He looked desperately at the 12 silent executives sitting along the mahogany table, attempting to recruit them into his delusion. He stammered that this was an entirely private marital dispute, a simple misunderstanding regarding the aggressive reallocation of joint marital assets. He waved his hand dismissively at the high-definition scan of the forged secondary mortgage, claiming I had given him verbal permission to secure business collateral and had just forgotten due to the heavy painkillers from my recent surgery. I was literally trying to gaslight a room full of apex financial directors, praying their corporate greed would somehow override the blatant documented evidence of felony bank fraud staring them right in the face. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to defend myself against his pathetic fabrications. I simply tapped a single key on my secure laptop. The primary display shifted instantly. The fraudulent mortgage vanished, replaced by a comprehensive 10-year overview of his entire professional career as a sales director. A sprawling bar graph materialized on the screen, detailing his quarterly commissions, his closed deals, and his overall performance metrics. David froze mid-sentence. The desperate, pleading smile slid entirely off his face. I folded my hands, resting them on the polished table, and looked at him with pure clinical detachment. I informed him that his entire professional identity was a meticulously constructed mirage. I explained to the board and to my horrified husband that his career had not been built on his aggressive sales tactics or his undeniable charisma. His career had been entirely propped up by my silent, invisible investments. I pointed to the massive spikes in his commission history over the past 3 years. I broke down the data for the executives in the room, identifying his top-tier clients, the massive accounts he constantly bragged about landing at family dinners. They were all shell companies, subsidiary holding firms, and tertiary investment groups, completely owned and operated by the Apex Trust. I had secretly directed those lucrative contracts his way. I had artificially padded his sales quotas with my own corporate capital just to keep his fragile masculine ego inflated and our household peaceful. He had never actually closed a major corporate deal on his own merit. He was not a corporate king preparing to conquer the industry. He was a mediocre mid-level salesman playing in a lucrative sandbox I had bought and paid for. The revelation hit him harder than the impending financial ruin. His chest heaved as the very last pillars of his artificial self-worth collapsed into dust. He looked down at his trembling hands, the expensive fabric of his wrinkled, damp suit suddenly looking like a clown costume. The 12 executives watched him with unfiltered, absolute disdain. They were not looking at a prospective business partner. They were observing a parasite that had finally been detached from its powerful host. He tried to step away from the podium, his legs visibly shaking. He looked at me, stripping away the slick corporate pitch and appealing to the one thing he thought he still controlled: our marriage. He begged me to turn off the screens. He pleaded that we were a team, that he had made a terrible lapse in judgment because the immense pressure of providing for our future had simply overwhelmed him. He actually tried to frame his embezzlement, his identity theft, and his luxury Aspen vacation as a sacrifice he made for the betterment of our household. I took a tentative step toward my end of the table, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine as he asked if we could just go back to our house and talk about this like adults. He promised he would pay back every single cent, swearing he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. I did not move a single muscle. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair, embodying the absolute, unwavering power of the empire I commanded. I let his pathetic apologies hang in the sterile, conditioned air of the boardroom, offering absolutely no comfort and no salvation. I looked at the man I had once vowed to spend my life with. I saw the cheap, duty-free perfume he had bought at the airport, sitting uselessly in his ruined, frozen car. I remembered the agonizing cold of the hospital curb, the searing physical pain of my surgical wound, and the arrogant, mocking caption his sister had posted from the bubbling hot tub. My compassion had been entirely burned away, leaving only a titanium core of resolve. My voice cut through his desperate stammering with the precise, lethal force of a surgeon's scalpel. "You left me to bleed out in the snow so you could ski on my dime." The absolute finality of my statement hung heavily in the room. David opened his mouth to formulate another pathetic excuse, to launch another desperate lie, but the words completely died in his throat. Behind him, the heavy double-oak doors of the boardroom swung open with a loud, authoritative crash. 2 individuals stepped into the room, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from a corporate audit to a law enforcement operation. They wore sharp, dark suits, their expressions unreadable and strictly professional. Clipped to their belts were the unmistakable gold shields of federal investigators. The taller agent, a broad-shouldered man with a severe buzz cut, bypassed the 12 stunned executives without asking for permission to speak. He marched directly to the mahogany podium, where my husband was still desperately clutching the polished wood. The agent reached into the back of his suit jacket and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clink of the chain was the only sound in the cavernous boardroom. He stated David's full legal name with absolute governmental authority. He informed my husband that he was under arrest for multiple federal offenses. The charges rolled off the agent's tongue like a perfectly orchestrated symphony: wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, grand larceny. Because David had utilized interstate digital banking networks to forge the secondary mortgage and funnel stolen funds across state lines to the luxury Aspen chalet. His desperate financial heist had automatically escalated from a local domestic dispute into a severe federal crime. David violently recoiled his back, slamming against the high-definition digital screens that were still broadcasting the irrefutable evidence of his guilt. He threw his hands up in a frantic defensive gesture, completely shattering his polished corporate facade. He yelled at the federal agents that this was a massive misunderstanding, a simple marital disagreement over joint assets that was being blown wildly out of proportion. He frantically pointed at me, sitting perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table, and screamed that I was just a bitter wife trying to ruin a vital business meeting. The federal agents did not even blink. The lead investigator grabbed David by the arm of his damp, wrinkled suit jacket, forcefully spinning him around. He shoved David face first against the expensive mahogany podium. The resounding slam of his chest hitting the wood echoed across the room. The agent grabbed David's wrists, pulling them sharply behind his back, and secured the cold steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. The heavy, definitive click of the locking mechanism signaled the absolute end of his freedom. Panic entirely consumed him. The reality of the cold steel biting into his skin bypassed his towering narcissism and struck his raw survival instinct. David twisted his neck, his eyes wild and bloodshot, and looked desperately at the 12 senior financial directors sitting along the table. He begged them to intervene. He pleaded with them to look at his sales projections, insisting that he could still make Apex Holdings millions of dollars if they just gave him a chance to explain the numbers. The executives did not offer a single shred of sympathy. One by one, they silently closed their leather portfolios, stood up from their chairs, and turned their backs on him. To them, he was no longer a prospective business partner. He was a massive corporate liability that had just been aggressively neutralized by their chairman. Realizing that his corporate audience had completely abandoned him, David spun his desperate attention back to me. The arrogance that had fueled him for the past 10 days completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic weeping coward. "Melanie, please!" he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched hysterical sob. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the sweat on his forehead. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot send me to federal prison. We are husband and wife. We are family. My mother and Caroline will be destroyed if I go to jail. Please, Melanie, show some mercy. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever you need. Just tell them to take these cuffs off." I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the searing physical pain still burning in my abdomen. I slowly stood up from the chairman's seat, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer with absolute unbothered precision. I walked deliberately down the length of the massive mahogany table, the rhythmic click of my heels commanding the silence of the room. I stopped just a few feet away from where the federal agents were holding him pinned against the podium. I looked down at the man who had stolen my money, forged my signature, leveraged my home, and left me bleeding on a freezing hospital curb so he could drink champagne in the snow. I looked into his terrified, weeping eyes and delivered the final verdict of our marriage. "I am just taking care of myself exactly like you told me to." The words struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. His chin dropped to his chest. A loud, guttural sob ripped from his throat as his knees buckled completely. The federal agents had to physically haul him upward by his armpits to keep him from collapsing onto the boardroom floor. The lead investigator read David his Miranda rights as they aggressively marched him toward the heavy double oak doors. I stood at the head of the table and watched the entire procession unfold. They dragged him out of the executive suite and shoved him into the high-speed glass elevator. The descent was a swift, merciless plunge from the top of the corporate world straight to the bottom. When the elevator doors slid open on the ground floor, David was thrust directly into the massive sunlit lobby of the Apex Holdings headquarters. The building was buzzing with the morning rush of elite financial professionals. Hundreds of sharply dressed employees, security guards, and visiting executives stopped dead in their tracks. The bustling noise of the lobby instantly died down into a shocked, widespread whisper. Every single eye in the massive glass atrium locked onto the disgraced sales director. The arrogant man who had proudly marched up to the reception desk just an hour ago, demanding premium access and boasting about his corporate genius, was now doing the ultimate walk of shame. He was paraded through the center of the lobby in handcuffs, his wrinkled suit hanging off his trembling frame, his face buried against his chest, in absolute unparalleled humiliation. The receptionist who had given him the executive elevator pass stood behind her marble desk watching him being hauled through the revolving glass doors and shoved aggressively into the back of a waiting federal transport vehicle. The heavy doors of the cruiser slammed shut, trapping him inside the cage. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging into the busy Chicago traffic, the siren wailed into the cold morning air, signaling the complete and permanent destruction of his career, his freedom, and his entire life. The wail of the federal transport siren faded into the biting Chicago wind, taking the very last remnants of my toxic marriage with it. Fast forward exactly 1 month, and the absolute financial vacuum I engineered finally collapsed in on the rest of his family. The domino effect was not just predictable, it was a mathematical certainty. Without my silent capital and the fraudulent credit lines David had illegally maintained, his mother and sister were left standing on a crumbling cliff of massive debt. As a forensic accountant, tracking the fallout of a seized asset portfolio is standard procedure. Watching it happen to the people who had treated me like disposable trash was an entirely different level of satisfaction. For 3 years, Barbara and Caroline had treated high society like their undeniable birthright, completely oblivious to the fact that their designer lifestyles were funded entirely by my stolen wages. The abrupt severing of those funds hit their checking accounts like a catastrophic earthquake. The first tremor struck on a crisp Tuesday morning in Oak Park. Caroline walked out of her sprawling suburban home holding a premium iced coffee, fully expecting to slide into the heated leather seats of her imported luxury SUV. Instead, she found a heavy-duty commercial tow truck idling loudly in her driveway. The repossession agent holding a clipboard with a glaring red delinquency notice did not care about her screaming tantrums or her aggressive threats to call the police. He simply secured the steel winch and hoisted the pristine $80,000 vehicle onto the flatbed. Caroline was forced to stand on her manicured lawn in her expensive silk pajamas, dropping her coffee onto the frozen grass, watching her primary status symbol get hauled down the street, while her wealthy neighbors peered through their plantation shutters. Barbara's downfall was even more spectacularly public. She had scheduled an extravagant midday luncheon for 8 of her wealthiest friends at her exclusive suburban country club, intending to gossip and drink premium imported wine. When the waiter brought the exorbitant bill, Barbara casually tossed down the heavy platinum card she had relied on for years. It was the exact card I had permanently deactivated during my corporate strike. The waiter returned 3 minutes later, accompanied by the general manager of the club. In the middle of the crowded, opulent dining room, the manager quietly but firmly informed Barbara that not only was her card heavily declined, but her elite membership was officially revoked due to months of severely unpaid dues that David had failed to cover. Her friends stared in absolute shock as she was asked to clear her tab with cash or leave the premises immediately. The woman who had mocked my career choices was forced to swallow her towering pride and beg one of the women she secretly despised to cover her lunch, completely shattering her carefully cultivated aristocratic facade in front of her entire social circle. The final crushing blow came from the only person in their orbit who possessed genuine integrity. Jamal had watched his wife and mother-in-law reveal their absolute depravity. As a brilliant African-American trauma surgeon who dealt with real life and death daily, his tolerance for their toxic superficial vanity had completely evaporated. When Caroline returned from her humiliating morning with the repossession agent, she found Jamal sitting calmly at the kitchen island. He did not yell. He did not argue. He simply pushed a thick stack of legally binding documents across the polished granite counter. They were fully executed divorce papers. Jamal looked at the woman he had married, his dark eyes reflecting absolute clarity and unwavering resolve. He informed Caroline that he had already legally separated all of their finances aggressively, securing his own hard-earned surgical income from her mounting catastrophic debt. He explicitly told her that witnessing her gleefully celebrate my hospitalization in Aspen while spending stolen money was the exact moment his marriage died. He refused to be legally or morally tethered to a family of parasites. He demanded she pack her bags and vacate his property by sunset, stripping her of the comfortable suburban fortress she had always taken for granted. Stripped of their stolen wealth, their luxury vehicles, and their affluent enablers, Barbara and Caroline were violently ejected from the high society they worshipped. The collection agencies were ruthless, garnishing what little legitimate income they could find. By the end of the month, the two women who had mocked my work ethic and treated me as a blind, disposable ATM were forced to sign a lease on a cramped, run-down one-bedroom apartment in a neglected, noisy corner of the city. As they dragged their remaining designer suitcases up 3 flights of narrow, scuffed stairs in a building that smelled faintly of mildew and old cooking oil, the brutal reality of their new existence firmly settled in. The flickering fluorescent light in the hallway buzzed a harsh, cheap rhythm. They unlocked the flimsy wooden door and stepped into a tiny, drafty living room. They were entirely cut off, sitting on a cheap second-hand sofa in the dark, staring at peeling wallpaper. The women who had toasted to my pain in a bubbling mountain hot tub were finally forced to live the exact impoverished, miserable life they so arrogantly believed they were far too good for. 6 months after the federal transport vehicle carried my ex-husband away, the brutal Chicago winter had completely surrendered to a vibrant, brilliant spring. The ice that once coated the city's streets had melted, taking the toxic remnants of my past life with it. I sat at a sunlit corner table inside a highly exclusive downtown bistro, swirling a glass of sparkling water. Sitting across from me was Jamal, wearing a crisp, casual suit instead of his usual green hospital scrubs. He looked 10 years younger. The heavy, exhausting burden of being tethered to a family of narcissistic parasites was entirely gone from his broad shoulders. We raised our glasses, the crystal chiming with a light, clear sound. We did not toast to David's federal indictment, nor did we celebrate the fact that Barbara and Caroline were currently navigating the brutal reality of a cramped, moldy apartment on the edge of the city limits. We did not waste our breath on people who no longer existed in our orbit. Instead, Jamal and I toasted to absolute freedom. He told me about his recent promotion to Chief of Trauma Surgery, a position he secured now that his mental energy was no longer drained by his ex-wife's constant superficial demands. I told him about stepping fully into the light, completely abandoning the anonymous shadow structure of the Apex Trust to run my empire openly. We had both been the outsiders, the hard-working professionals brought into a family that viewed us strictly as utility tools. Now we were the only ones who had walked away with our dignity, our wealth, and our sanity entirely intact. Stepping into my power publicly shifted the entire trajectory of my corporate career. I no longer hid behind a board of directors or minimized my presence to protect a fragile male ego. I took my rightful seat at the head of the Apex Holdings table every single morning. The executives who had witnessed my clinical dismantling of David now answered directly to me, their respect forged in the fires of that ruthless boardroom execution. But acquiring wealth and multiplying capital was no longer my sole motivation. My experience had opened my eyes to a terrifying reality. If a highly trained forensic accountant could be financially manipulated by a deceitful spouse, women without my specialized background were standing on incredibly dangerous ground. I utilized the massive resources of Apex Holdings to establish a specialized financial protection firm. I began deploying a team of elite forensic auditors and legal experts to assist women attempting to escape financially abusive marriages. We tracked hidden offshore accounts, exposed forged credit lines, and dismantled the exact shadow economies men, like David, used to trap their spouses. I turned the worst, most traumatic betrayal of my life into a weapon of mass protection for others. I spent my afternoons advising clients, teaching them how to read a balance sheet, how to lock down their personal credit, and how to build a fortress around their hard-earned independence. I replaced the lingering sting of betrayal with the undeniable satisfaction of watching other women reclaim their absolute power. Later that evening, I left the Apex corporate headquarters and returned to my new personal sanctuary. I had sold the sprawling suburban house where David had abandoned me, liquidating the property and using a fraction of the proceeds to purchase a sprawling 2-story penthouse right in the heart of the Chicago financial district. I walked through the massive open-concept living space, the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. The space was warm, vibrant, and filled with art and furniture that reflected my own personal taste, entirely scrubbed of the sterile, pretentious aesthetic my ex-husband had always demanded. I poured myself a glass of vintage red wine and stepped out onto the expansive private balcony. The warm evening breeze swept off Lake Michigan, wrapping around me like a comforting embrace. I rested my forearms against the cool glass railing and looked down at the bustling, illuminated streets, hundreds of feet below. I thought back to that freezing night in November. I remembered the sheer physical agony of sitting in that hospital wheelchair, the terrifying realization of being locked out of my own home, and the bone-chilling cold that had almost broken my spirit. I instinctively reached down, letting my fingers brush gently against the fabric of my silk blouse, tracing the faint raised line of the surgical scar hidden beneath. The scar was no longer a symbol of vulnerability or victimhood. It had healed beautifully, transforming into a permanent physical testament to my absolute survival. It was a reminder that I had faced the absolute worst of human betrayal and emerged completely unbreakable. David had tried to strip me of my resources, my health, and my dignity, believing he could leave me to die in the cold while he ascended to a fabricated throne. Instead, he was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, stripped of his custom Italian suits and his stolen credit cards, facing a future defined entirely by concrete walls and iron bars. Looking out over the sprawling electric empire, I commanded a profound sense of peace settled deep into my chest. The anger that had fueled my ruthless corporate takeover had completely evaporated, leaving behind a tranquil, unshakable confidence. I had learned the ultimate truth about vengeance. The most devastating permanent revenge you can ever inflict upon toxic, manipulative people does not require screaming matches or bitter public fights. The greatest revenge is simply building a beautiful, untouchable life that they are completely banished from ever experiencing. If you have ever been abandoned in your darkest hour by the people who swore to protect you, know that your lowest moment is not your final chapter. Your strength is a currency they can never forge, and your future is an empire they can never steal. Have you ever turned a massive betrayal into your greatest success? Share your stories of reclaiming your power in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute resilience. Remember, the truth always leaves a paper trail, and your best life is always waiting on the other side of the fire. The freezing wind of that November night stripped away more than just my physical comfort. It shattered the illusion of my marriage. Looking back, the most profound lesson I learned was not about tracking hidden assets or dismantling a fraudulent empire. It was about recognizing my own inherent power. David believed that my vulnerability was a weakness he could exploit. He assumed that leaving me bleeding on a hospital curb would break my spirit, making me blind to his financial predation. Instead, that absolute betrayal acted as a catalyst. It taught me that true security never comes from a wedding ring or empty promises. It comes from an unwavering reliance on yourself. I learned that we teach people how to treat us. For too long, I minimized my success to protect his fragile ego, allowing his toxic family to treat me as a mere utility. But stepping into the light and wielding my own authority changed everything. Financial independence is vital, but emotional independence is the ultimate fortress. You must be willing to ruthlessly excise those who view your kindness as a weakness. Sometimes the most devastating fires do not destroy you. They clear the ground for a much stronger foundation. You are the architect of your own survival. Have you ever experienced a crushing betrayal from someone you completely trusted, only to use that pain to rebuild an even better life? How did you find the strength to reclaim your power? Please share your story and leave a comment below. Like and subscribe for more.